welcome to the Stoner Story Witch podcast, and my first official season. This season I will be diving deeply into the 2019 movie Little Women, based off of Louisa May Alcott's 1860 novel. So before I jump into today's episode, I just wanted to take a little bit of time to just, I guess, kind of situate ourselves in this story. I think if we just kind of think about stories in general, and a period piece like Little Women, or another one of my favorites is Pride and Prejudice, it can be, I think, tempting to consider like, okay, like this is real life, but thank goodness, like it's not like that anymore, right? Thank goodness we are so enlightened now, as opposed to considering how are these struggles that these characters are going through similar struggles that people in similar positionalities are still going through, that we might be at different points on a timeline, but we're on the same timeline. Can we challenge ourselves to consider that they are us and we are them? And in, I guess, a similar way that even science fiction or fantasy can just kind of, it can in a way almost give us this illusion of being an outsider that can allow you to see things a little bit more clearly than if it were taking place in, a real world timeline that is like, concurrent with the day with the times that you're watching it. So I hope that all of that makes sense. I guess my hope in this podcast is to bridge the gap in that this is a period piece. It is taking place in a different timeline, but I want us to locate ourselves in the story. Like, I will be locating myself in the story. Like, who am I aspiring to be? Who do I identify with, and in what ways? And yeah, not think that just because something is old, this is truly, an old story that takes place long ago. And of course it's been redone with, some, I would say, modern flair, but it's still overall this old novel. And I think it's worth our time to look through it through my Stoner Story Witch lens, which I will highlight for you here to just kind of give you the scope of what this season will be. It's going to be impossible for me to not be projecting my own lens, my own biases, my own self into where exactly the conversation goes this season. I will say that season 1 or episode 1 is very much related to my positionality as a cishet white woman. I'm married to a cishet white man. We, as a matter of fact, just celebrated our 10-year wedding anniversary. And while I have never been more in love with my husband, I have simultaneously never felt more rage at the patriarchy than I have in very recent weeks and months and years. So episode 1, which I will get to in a moment here, because this is the first episode, is going to be an exploration of the question, is it possible to earn secure attachment across differences of power, rank, and privilege? I will be looking specifically at 4 men in Jo's life. There's Mr. Dashwood, there's her father, Laurie, and Friedrich, looking at how she relates to them and how they shape her attachment, as well as how they shape her creative trajectory. I will get into that more in a moment. I will say that episode 2, I'll be diving a little bit deeper into the actual kind of tools and how-to of secure attachment via contact nutrition. I will be using examples from the film to point out crucial moments of secure attachment as well as misattunements. And I will name now and in that episode that I am very heavily integrating the courses that I've taken from Carmen Spagnola on secure attachment and contact nutrition and just relating it to this story. In episode 3, I will be projecting a little bit into the March sisters, considering the questions: in what ways do they provide us a lens to see ourselves? So like, in what ways do I see myself in them? What archetypes do they as characters represent? On which thresholds are they standing? What needs are they signifying? What are the choices that they're needing to make? And in episode 4, I'll be exploring what happens when we drop the narrative that humans can be villains. I just saw a meme recently that the gist of it is, we need to be hard on systems yet soft on people. And so I will say episode 4 is going to require tolerating a nuanced conversation, and I will name that I have not always historically been able to do that. So I will be inviting people to consider whether they truly consent to listen to that one. And then invitation to liberation is the theme of episode 5, where I'll be poking at the cracks in the walls that the film offers and relating it to Hadestown archetypes, just the story as a tool of liberation. And then in episode 6, it will be a little bit more personal. It'll be my reflections on just the process of making this podcast, the emerging metaphors that have come up, other lessons that I've learned through just creating the podcast. Because I truly believe that our creations mold us just as much, if not more, than we create them. And when I am in deep prayer and contemplation with this work, I keep just being overwhelmed by the message that the product isn't the point, the process is. And so it didn't feel right to have an entire season with focusing on a story that doesn't somehow just invite the question of what is the process. And I have begun to record this episode, and this is the one particular episode that I imagine I will be adding to it until the week that it comes out. So, all right, so then that's the scope of our 6 episodes. So I will begin with our episode 1 here, which is secure attachment and the male gaze. My biggest teacher by far on secure attachment is Carmen Spagnola. I cannot recommend the Numinous Network. I cannot recommend that highly enough. So please check her out. She also has a podcast called The Numinous Podcast, and you can look up her teachings on secure attachment. I will say here, just to provide some Spark Notes context here, that the definition of secure attachment that I am using is it's the ability to land in yourself and to engender in someone else the feeling of being safe, seen, secure, and soothed. And what does it mean to be safe, seen, secure, and soothed? So let's go through. To be safe is to feel free from physical harm as well as psychological terror. To be seen is to feel that all parts of you are welcome in that relationship, in that space. To be secure means that you can consistently rely on that person to be able to meet you and match you and get you, and that if they miss a tune, that they will be able to repair any hurt or harm that they've caused. And to be soothed means that this person can co-regulate with you in a way that works for you, that they are attuned to you and can kind of bring you back into a regulated state. So a little bit of jargon here is that in moments where we don't feel secure, you could say that like those moments are moments where you would be feeling dysregulated. And we can develop practices within ourselves to self-regulate, bring us back into a regulated state, back into a secure state. Others can also co-regulate with us, which means that they would have practices of helping us feel safe, seen, secure, and soothed. And the mechanism for that co-regulation I will get into in the next episode via contact nutrition. But when we're looking at just secure attachment, just as a general sense of that we have safety, we have dignity, we have belonging in our relationships, it's really important to name that in imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, as termed by bell hooks, and I may, throughout the podcast, just kind of shorten it to modernity. But in modernity, or in imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, it is extremely hard to cultivate and maintain secure attachment, and especially across lines of power, rank, and privilege. That it is not something that can just accidentally happen. It has to be very intentionally noticed and named and worked on. In my own personal experience, there's levels of shame resilience on the people in the up power position, and that it's important to name as well that if you're in a relationship with someone where maybe you're ignorant of, or you are not sure that you are in the up power position, is an abuse of power. That there is going to be an inability of creating secure attachment without that level of awareness and work. I'm going to use, quote unquote, the male gaze as a shorthand for women's experiences in relationship to men. It is their felt experience of constantly tracking how men are perceiving you and a self-concern with your own palatability in order to just survive the patriarchy. So to be clear, when I say the male gaze, the point isn't whether men consciously or even unconsciously hold these thoughts and feelings, because the male gaze, as I am using it, is centering the women's experience of what it is to survive. I want us to just consider the shorthand of how the war is talked about in this film. It's archetypally, I would kind of just be able to say that like the war is kind of this patriarchy. It is an overarching context that's out of our control and keeps us from experiencing real secure attachment with men. And this is like including men. I don't actually know that men can, I don't know that they can actually experience secure attachment. I don't know that patriarchy teaches them how to experience it with anyone. Also, it's blatantly clear to me from the book, I have read a little bit of the book, as well as the 2019 movie, that Jo is, like, in a different context, would 100% be identifying as queer in some way, if not, like, a trans man. Like, it is dripping in the book. It is well preserved in the film. So, yeah, it's mentioned several times that she wishes she were a boy. And at one point she wishes that she could have gone off to fight in the war. She wants to be included in the war. And for me, I think that it's like this patriarchy is operating in ways that exclude trans men from their full expression and from participating in the world as their true gender. is like the way that I kind of like feel into that. And I'm not a queer theorist. It's a question that I want to just be holding tenderly, because I think that I can't talk about the male gaze without naming just how much Joe seems to identify with wanting to be a man in some way, whether it's just that level of access to power and privilege that she is so conscious that she doesn't have. It's certainly not a theme that is discussed. Little Women is a really great invitation into just that question of like, how have I been conditioned to be a certain way or be attracted to a certain type of gender? Valid question, and I don't have any sort of answers. I'm just naming that is a question. Okay, so in this episode, I'm going to discuss the four men of her father, Mr. Dashwood, Friedrich, and Laurie, how she relates to them, how they shape her attachment, and the role that they play in her creative trajectory. And we see this evolution evidenced and laid out in her relationship with these four men. So let's dig in. Okay, so let's start with the father. Okay, so Joe's father is what I would say, like, the role that he plays is this moral compass of the family. So the father character is about what I think a literal inaccessibility of a man who, we presume, will shower you with feelings of being safe, seen, secure, and soothed, because he's also seemingly elevated to some godliness. He's some figurative kind of moral compass. The father in the March family is often discussed as some families might talk about their God or their religion. We see from how his daughters receive his telegraph to how they receive Marmie's suggestion that they give the Hummels their breakfast. They say, "Is this the part where you tell us that this is what father would want?" And I'll discuss later how valuable I feel it is to have a moral compass that's just openly discussed as a family. And also I want to name that when a godlike figure is also an actual literal person, it can engender a feeling of conditional love, which is not being fully seen, where all parts of you are welcome. So luckily, the sisters have Marmee, who I will get to in a later episode, who I will just say skillfully navigates the family via her interpretation of the moral compass of father. So all of this to say, we don't actually see much data in the film supporting that Joe, or really any of the girls, actually seems to feel a sense of safe, seen, secure, and soothed by their father. But this figure of father does lay some, I guess, moral groundwork that I think is really imperative to reaching towards what they care about. And that is an expression that I've learned from Carmen, as far as like, when we are secure in ourselves, like what, like the greater why that we are working towards secure attachment is so that we can be reaching towards what it is that we care about in our days and in our lives. So I'm not saying that the father isn't valuable. He's the moral compass, but as far as the actual relationship that the girls can have with him, I just don't see it. It seems like there's too much worry that there's going to be some sort of belonging that they might be toying with if they don't, let's say, give up their breakfast for the Hummels. All right, so let's move on to Mr. Dashwood here. So Mr. Dashwood to me represents this gatekeeper of public palatability. He is the limited imagination of modernity. He is also economic exploitation. So In the beginning of the movie, we see that Jo does not actually intend nor desire to be seen by Mr. Dashwood. She is signing a name that isn't hers. She's pretending to be someone that she isn't in order to sell her stories. He insists that the war is over. People want to be amused, not preached at. And being told that her morality, her sense of justice, has no place in his paper. And yes, chronologically speaking, we hear that the war is over, and it is a cue to us in this movie that is kind of going back and forth in timelines, that we are in the future time. But this phrase also informs us that the world that Jo is living in is one that's going to pretend like these capital T traumas that have severed us from secure attachment. I've listed patriarchy, but we know that it could be white supremacy or even COVID, are no longer present. So therefore, it's not really worth writing about. I just think like, oh, COVID's over when people talk about like the pandemic in past tense as if there's still not thousands of people dying and being disabled by long COVID. But I'll get to that in a later episode as well. All right, so what is left once Mr. Dashwood has removed the bulk of her content and dictated that women must either be married or die in the end is a piece that he explicitly underpays for. He says, we usually pay 25 to 30 for that sort of thing, and I'll pay you 20 for that. And it's noteworthy that Jo seems just thrilled to be leaving with that. That feels very complicated to just like know that you are being exploited, but to just be so so grateful for even just the small piece that you get. That's heavy. Mr. Dashwood lays the foundation that the world that Jo occupies is not one where she can be seen. She seems to be holding the belief that my authenticity isn't welcome, but at least I'm a competent writer. So we see that, as a child, she was able to be her authentic self. She was able to be seen, at least in her own home. And she's going off of that. She's a writer, and like that's a thing that matters, and that's like a thing that she can feel secure about. And then comes Friedrich, and Friedrich, I would say, is kind of the fear and desire continuum around being fully seen in her creativity. So Friedrich sees that Jo is a passionate writer. He says, you don't get ink stains like that because you need to pay the bills. He wants to actually see Jo. And it seems that Jo wants to be seen by him and perhaps doesn't feel safe to do so yet. We see that she only gives him clippings of things that she's published because Mr. Dashwood has convinced her that her authenticity isn't welcome. She isn't seen or celebrated for her actual talents, only her ability to reproduce what is already palatable in the limited imagination of patriarchy. So Friedrich asks, like, hey, why, like, this isn't your name? And she lies. It's my belief that she lies. And of course, he doesn't know that she's lying, right? Like, I do not believe for 1 second that she's worried about Marmy. My mother will worry. I believe that Jo doesn't sign her name to her stories because deep down she's not proud of it. I will die on this hill. Friedrich just wants to be Friedrich. And to Jo, he is this male gaze. She is not experiencing him as like just some, like, he has power, he has a rank, he has privilege that she doesn't have. And she is taking a huge fucking intimacy risk here that I don't think he fully sees because he hasn't been conditioned to. However, Friedrich seems that he actually does want to see her and to offer her, he says, the honesty and all the intelligence that I can muster. But again, he doesn't track power, rank, and privilege until it is too late. He asks her only after she gets angry, has no one ever respectfully and honestly offered feedback on your work? His bewilderment at her reaction shows that he wasn't tracking the grueling loneliness of what it must be like as a woman writer, and how honest feedback can feel aggressive. I will say more about this in my next episode on contact nutrition. But I will just say that this is the same dynamic that happens anytime a man wants to, well, actually, or I'm just being a devil's advocate in like any conversation with any woman. It is just an express pass to dysregulation for her nervous system and confusion, I guess, for him, but only if he remains clueless to his power, rank, and privilege, also known as his role as the male gaze in her life. He was offering his honesty and intelligence, but she is craving his praise after being just so invisible to Mr. Dashwood. And the incongruence of what he's offering and what she's craving is this just recipe for a relational rupture. So he's actually saying super nice things, and I will go over the scene that I'm talking about. But when she is showing him his work, she's saying like, the world will not forget Jo March, but they will forget you. And he's like, I can believe that. And then he's like, she's like, why don't you be a writer? And he says, well, I don't have the gifts you have. And none of this is landing in Jo, because she's so swept up in his critique of her writing. And of course, we can see that it isn't actually her writing. It is just the parts of her that are palatable to Mr. Dashwood. And this is why I get so frustrated at men, like Laurie does this to Meg too, right? When he says, oh, I don't like all the fuss and feathers and all this makeup or Botox, or like just literally insert anything that anybody does to be more palatable within patriarchy, as if that choice isn't something that has been historically aided towards women's survival, towards their safety, dignity, and belonging in these fucked up systems. Like, I just can't. So the fact that he's like, oh, I don't really like this. I mean, of course he doesn't see it, but it's just like, oh, this thing that you're doing to please Mr. Dashwood, I don't really like it. It's literally the same fucking thing that Laurie does to Meg. Like, I don't like all the fuss and feathers. Well, why might she think she needs fuss and feathers? Why might she be conditioned to think that, and it's like, I am not blaming any fucking woman for wanting to wear makeup, but men for being like, I just don't really like a woman in makeup, can just fuck right off. Okay. Doing a little stretch. Jo seems reasonably safe, actually, with Friedrich. She's free from physical harm and psychological terror, yet she is actually not allowing herself to be fully seen in the same ways that she doesn't want to be fully seen by Mr. Dashwood. She doesn't believe that all parts of her are welcome, and she leaves New York before she can actually feel any sense of consistency, or that Friedrich would be making an attempt to repair harm. I am going to make some space in the next episode to discuss how I think he could have soothed or co-regulated with Jo in a way that might have worked for her, be a more attuned friend. But Jo essentially leaves Friedrich with this belief that from Mr. Dashwood, she had this, my authenticity isn't welcome, but at least I can write, is now, I guess maybe I am not a very good writer, but at least I have my family. At least I have my family. So she's just getting cut down. She's getting cut down by Mr. Dashwood. She's getting cut down by Friedrich. And then we have Laurie. Laurie is this, I think his role in Jo's life is that, is it better to love or to be loved? And that's a question that Marmee ultimately poses to her. Laurie is a dear companion to Jo her whole life, and yet we see she bats away any affectionate touch from him multiple times throughout the film. She has made it abundantly clear that she wishes that she were or was a boy, that she has no desire to marry, and he just refuses to actually believe her, I guess, or truly see that that's what she might mean. I don't know. I believe that Laurie, who is an orphan and is wealthy and therefore has lots of abandonment and attachment issues, copes with adopting an anxious attachment style. He is pursuing Joe, and he's saying he's even giving up billiards for her, which is like giving up the things that he enjoys is just a breeding ground for future resentments that Joe predicts would happen if they did marry. He really seems to love how she defies convention. He mentions in several moments in the film, like, your mother's daughter. Like, I think he says this to Meg and Amy and Joe, like, oh, that's funny hearing, those are funny words hearing out of the mouth of one of your mother's daughters, kind of thing. Like, so it's like, it's almost like he, you know, it's this like love of Marmee, and maybe Marmee as like this mother that he never got to I don't know. He wants to belong in their family. He wants to belong in their home. We actually see when he takes Meg home from the ball that there's like almost this reluctance that he has in entering the home. Like, wait, am I allowed? Is this okay? Like, but he seems to really want to see what it's all about. But Joe doesn't love him as she should. And that feels like a rejection to him only because he hasn't actually seen her in the fact that she doesn't want to have the weight of all of those gendered expectations that come when a woman marries a man. By marrying Laurie, she would have to be a mistress of his fine house. It's a role that she would loathe and resent him for. And this is like just feeling, I just need to take a pause and just say, like, as I am nearing my 10-year wedding anniversary, it is literally like the idea of like the ways that, like, as my love for my partner aside, like just the ways that I fucking don't consent to just the structure of what it is to just be in a heteropatriarchal marriage within these heteropatriarchal systems. Like, to just be in a cis-het marriage in a world that wants to, it's like, I'm just like, that is just rage that I'm feeling. I don't have any answers. It's just the location of where I am and the time that I'm pressing record on this. But just the wisdom that Joe has as, like, I don't know, 17-year-old or whatever, to just be like, yeah, no. Like, I don't know. No. I'm not doing that. Fucking love that for her. Okay, and I have written down here, back to my notes here, that I have been wrestling with this question of, like, does Laurie actually love Amy properly, or is she second to Joe? Which is like a thing that she's very like, I will not be second place. And while there's a lot that we like don't actually see in the film, right? We see Amy is telling Aunt March that she refused Fred, but then we also see that Laurie is going to travel with them back to the States because Aunt March is sick, and then somehow on the journey, I guess, they get married, and then but then also Aunt March dies. There's a weird kind of timeline that just I think there's a lot that we don't see, obviously. But is it interesting that Amy's saying, like, the way she says, I didn't love Fred as I should. It is the same words that Joe used when turning down Laurie. And it's that same bucking of convention that one would expect of one of their mother's daughters. But when Amy says it, it is admitting that she's saying no to Fred because she loves Laurie. That Laurie can actually be loved and love. That, like, there is so much that he loves about one of their mother's daughters, and that she's loved him his whole life. And it's like, can he actually, like, he's on his own attachment journey, I guess, of pursuing this woman who does not want him, who will just abandon him in, let's just say, the same way he probably felt abandoned by his parents' death. And actually, like, maturing and being like, wait, like, I don't need to be repeating this pattern of abandonment, and I can find love in this woman. And, like, I love that for Laurie. I'm glad he figured it out. There's a prominent time of the male gaze operating differently in this context of there's a lot of times that we actually do see Laurie and his grandfather, like, staring out the window down, like, literally, I think it's like down the hill at the March women. So like take that for what it is. But we see that in the scene where Marmee is preparing to leave to go to Father after he's been injured. And we see Mr. Lawrence and Laurie, as well as John Brooke, all kind of on this outer circle of support for these women as they all circle up in preparation of Marmee's departure. And it's this longful gaze at this inner circle of these women all coming together. This inner circle, you know, despite the patriarchy that allows them less privilege and fewer choices, they have this community, this belongingness of being one of the women. And it's something that these men just, in this moment, it seems like they yearn to support it and also to be a part of this, like I say, this community and this belongingness and this acknowledgement that like none of these men have that thing. And even in this moment, like they are all offering all this care and all of this support. And it's like, it's almost kind of like that, well, is anybody going to ask them to come in for a hug? And it's like maybe like I feel like they wanted to be in that hug. They're like there's this longing gaze. There's this acknowledgement that it's born out of necessity. It's born out of necessity of surviving. But then it's this weird like jealousy that, well, because your oppression is making it necessary for you to have this deeper connection. But then there's this moment of wait, but I want that, it feels to me. So all of that is just that this male gaze of patriarchy is not actually offering any sense of secure attachment to men. It is, I think, a very poignant and short little scene of like the ways that men are also harmed by the patriarchy. And not that we're going to focus a lot of attention necessarily on how people in the up power positions are harmed, but like I want this to be a nuanced space where we can just accept that like no, that the only villains are systems of oppression, that we just have people on various stages of being hurt and being harmed, and that I feel compassion for these men and just really high standards of how they operate in the world. So now we have Joe's gaze. And we learn that, or we see how Joe feels this immense loneliness after she rejects Laurie's proposal. She comes back home and she's kind of lamenting to Marmee. She says, family used to be enough, but it isn't anymore. And of course, it's the loss of her childhood and it's her severance from her creativity that I believe is the source of her discontent. She says, like, the family used to be enough, but why was the family enough? Well, because like the family would like take part in the plays that she would write. And it was this like playful connection, shared rhythm that they would all have together. And so there's this moment, right? There's literally this effect of the male gaze where we, like I say, we just see these moments where men are looking as an outsider on these women's lives. That Joe is really reaching towards being good enough. Being good enough as a daughter, being good enough to be published, being good enough to be esteemed by an expert in the field, good enough for her family. She finally gets to a point where she gains security with herself and deems herself good enough and worthy enough to make her life matter by writing about it. We see at Beth's funeral, we zoom in on Joe gazing at her as Beth's body is being lowered into the ground. And then that gaze then transports us to this earlier time that Joe gazed on Beth. It was before Meg's wedding. It is this emphasizing that whether it be through marriage or death, thanks to the limited imagination of Mr. Dashwood and the patriarchy, that childhood must end. It is in that we see it's either ending in in Beth's death, Meg's marriage, and Joe's belief of, I can't write, but at least I have my family, brings her to this rock bottom. Beth has died. Laurie has moved on. She literally has like no other choice. She can't just settle for being loved. And she honors her sister by making her life important, by writing about it. That to her gaze, her trans male gaze perhaps, their lives mattered. A thing that Amy says that like writing about it confers importance, right? That it's like writing about it makes it important. So it is by writing the novel, it is by making a story that Jo is ultimately engendering in herself and her sisters those feelings of being safe, seen, secure, and soothed. Thank you so much for tuning in to episode 1, Secure Attachment and the Male Gaze as Told Through Little Women. I want to send my gratitude to the work of Carmen Spagnola and the Numinous Network for her courses specifically on secure attachment as well as contact nutrition. And I want to thank Matt Shuby for the podcast art, my husband Kevin Carlo for all his help in the creation of the theme song for the podcast, and Aeneas Mitchell and John Williams for their inspiration of Hedwig's theme and Hadestown. The next episode will be a deep dive into contact nutrition and misattunements, so stay tuned for that. And before I sign off, I would like to leave you with a quote from another one of my teachers, Rev. Angel Kyoto Williams, who says, "Love and justice are not two. Without inner change, there can be no outer change. And without collective change, no change matters."